From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Hi there, my name is Nicholas Brown and I'm a music specialist with the Library of Congress. It's my great pleasure to introduce you to Thomas Wilkins, who is the music director of the Omaha Symphony and principal conductor of the Hollywood Bowl Orchestra. Thank you, Maestro, for being here.
My pleasure.
We are here today commemorating the Shift Festival of American Orchestras. Could you tell us a bit about that and your involvement in the festival?
I was just asked to serve on a panel to discuss really one of the things that Shift is all about is redefining or shifting, if you will, the orchestra's role in the communities that they serve, and with the hopes that in each case, specific to the community that they're in, that it would extend beyond just playing concerts. And the orchestras that I have been involved with, and even now, we have always been about that. And so they thought perhaps I was a good person to come and make up some answers.
Great. So the festival is being co-presented by the Kennedy Center and also Washington Performing Arts, and the library was a partner today for the symposium. Right. What is your impression of these, the two principal presenters of the festival, in the impact that they're having with changing the narrative about orchestras in this country?
I think the fact that they actually are big voices in the industry is really important. Mm-hmm. You know, there in some parts of the country where orchestras are small and they have quote unquote the services, the burn. And by that, what I mean is that they have plenty of musician time that they can do things more creatively sometimes than a larger organization can. Larger organizations, major orchestras, really haven't had to do those things before. So now that we're all figuring out that no one needs to be left behind, regardless of what size city you're from, I think it's really important that the major players are also the ones waving the banners as well. Mm-hmm.
Could you tell us a bit about what you're doing specifically in Omaha and with Hollywood Bowl in terms of engaging new audiences and perhaps changing the public's perception about orchestral music?
For me, it starts from the basic premise that music is life-altering and life-affirming. You know, as I said to the group earlier today, I was a kid born to a single mother on welfare in a housing project, no predisposition to classical music whatsoever. So that when I heard the orchestra for the first time at 8 years old, that was what I wanted to do. I didn't have words to describe how impacted I was, mm-hmm. But it meant that all of the critical life choice questions that kids are faced with today were answered for me by default because I'd fallen in love with music. Do I go to college? What's the nature of my friends? Where do I find myself when there's no adult supervision? All of those questions were answered because of music. Mm-hmm. So if I believe, and incidentally, I will say that says more about the power of music than it does about me. So if I believe that, then that gift of the power of music should be handed to as many people in as many possible ways as we can come up with. And so we've always had, especially in a place like Omaha, community partners that range anywhere from the Omaha Housing Authority to Girls Inc. to University of Nebraska Medical Center to hospice care. And we don't walk in with a program that says, you know, here we're from the government, we're here to help. Yeah. We want to know what your needs are. And in some of those cases, it is just about access to a place that's different from the place that they spend most of their time. And that place for us happens to be the concert hall. Mm-hmm. And lo and behold, in that place, they get the gift of music, a world that they didn't think had any relation to them whatsoever. So those are the kinds of things that we do in Omaha, and of course at the Hollywood Bowl, we are very much committed to our YOLA program, Youth Orchestra Los Angeles, and now we've been doing it for so long that we've actually seen kids graduate, and they're mm-hmm. They're off to college and doing great things. So that's a neat experience.
Wonderful. So in those projects that you're working on, do you see that there are now different or new opportunities for youth to get involved with classical music as opposed to when you were growing up? or is it just new packaging for the same types of engagement?
Ooh, that's a good question. Well, the problem I didn't have when I was growing up was I didn't have the challenge of there being too many options for me. None of us kids did, you know. And nowadays, a lot of things have happened that has almost exacerbated the problem of trying to get kids to music. Mm-hmm. One of which seems to be preparing them for college. You know, there are all these other kinds of things. I'm really glad that the folks who came up with the idea of STEM are starting to believe that it really needs to be STEAM, that there needs to be an arts component. But so I didn't have all of those obstacles, as it were. So I had plenty of time for music. I think it is, and beyond obstacles now in the 21st century, it's just believing that this music has some application to your life. And I have always been about, if a kid comes to one of my children's concerts, for example, there are a couple things I want them to see. I want them to see that the orchestra is probably one of the best representations of a community that exists in our society. All different instruments, all different voices, all different sizes, all different levels of power and strength and weakness to that end, and yet they figure out a way to work together so that this incredible, powerful, beautiful product happens. You know, the diverse group of individuals working together for a common good. So I want them to see that first, and that their families can work the same way as an orchestra can work, and their classrooms can work the same way, and their neighborhoods can work the same way as an orchestra works. The other thing that I want them to understand is that this music has a direct relationship to their everyday lives. And so if I do a program that's about meter and pulse and music, it's really about perseverance. If I do a program that's built around the idea of orchestration, it's about teamwork. Mm-hmm. So those kinds of things happen. And then I want them to understand that this orchestra on stage is theirs, that this room is theirs. They're welcome at any time. In fact, I make a habit now of even in Omaha at subscription concerts, I'm seeing young children.
Great.
And if they're sitting in the first row, they get a fist bump from me on the way in or on the way out. You know, I give them some wild, goofy eye, because they thought they were coming to one of these, and all of a sudden the conductor's fist bumping them in a concert. Where's the decorum in that? Well, I don't care where it is. You know, I want them to feel welcome there. So.
Well, it's very refreshing. I'm appreciative as a concert goer and musician myself of that attitude, because you know, I go into concerts or whatever and I experience people getting chastised because they're sharing with their friend how much they enjoyed it. Right. And of course there are rules that should be respected, like not interrupting your neighbor and that kind of business. Right. But breaking that wall and making it a collaborative experience, I think, is such a huge part of it. So thank you for your work in that.
Yeah, I actually, one time, I did a set of, it was a long suite of like 12 movements. Could have been Shostakovich, but the piece is not coming to mind just yet. And I explained to the audience before that there were 12 movements, and the look of panic on their faces. But I said they were short, and in some instances they were really, really short. And so we get to the end of the first movement in the concert, and I turned around to the audience and said, 1, and just turned back around, and that was all. That was all that was required. Yeah. It was just break the ice, and now let's have some fun. Neat. You know.
So in your own growing up with music, you said when you were 8 years old was when you first experienced an orchestra. Was that the moment where you said, I want to be a conductor, or just that I want to be in music?
Isn't that funny? That's the moment that I said I wanted to be a conductor. There was something about this man, Russell Stanger was his name. This was the Norfolk Symphony Orchestra. Now it's the Virginia Symphony, Joanne's Folletta's Orchestra. There was something about the sound, first of all. I'd never heard an orchestra before. But then maybe it was his movements or whatever, his exuberance, whatever it was, there was something about him that said to me, that's the fun spot down there. That's the spot that's closest to all of that sound down there. It's not the guy with the long blonde hair playing the snare drum, though that looks pretty cool. But this guy was just, you know, all over the place with this music. And I liken it now to in McDonald's, the restaurant, a lot of McDonald's playlands, they would have those pits with all plastic
Oh, yeah.
colored balls and nets around it, and my kids would love to go in there and get under them and dive and hide. And so for me, that's what sound is like. That's what it's like being on the podium. It's like being in one of those, and you're just surrounded by sound. And so that was the thing that got me right away. Yeah.
So how did you get from that 8-year-old person with a vision and a sort of idea of the future for themselves to being a professional conductor?
At the very beginning, and when I talk to grown-ups about how we relate to children, one of the things I make note of with them is that when I came home and said in my neighborhood, in the hood, that I wanted to be a conductor, no one ever looked at me and said, "No, dude, young black boys don't grow up to be conductors." Nobody ever said that to me. In fact, you know, a lot of times I got, "Oh, boy, you're going to be the first black Leonard Bernstein." You know,
Nice.
and, you know, I was shocked. Now, I tell you something about Bernstein's impact,
Yeah.
that even in that neighborhood, people knew that name. And so we have to be careful what words we use when we talk to children about their dreams and about their goals in their lives. And no one clipped my wings, as it were. So that was the first thing that happened. But then the very next year was 4th grade, and that was the year that you could start to play an instrument. And so, but everyone had to start on violin.
Oh, really?
And this was pre-desegregation. And what I learned later as a grown-up, talk about fortuitousness. I made that word up. But I went back to visit my elementary school principal as a grown-up. She's now an old lady, and she recounted the story of how she was a little lady, you know, like this, Miss Robertson, and she went down to the school board and she said, "If you're going to put strings in those white schools, you're going to put them in my school."
Wow.
And they just could not say no to her. And had she not done that, that violin wouldn't have been there for me.
That's amazing.
Yeah. So that was 4th grade, and then we could switch in 5th grade, and I switched to cello. That sort of became my principal instrument. And then in 7th grade, so I played cello in the orchestra. 7th grade, I wanted to get a band uniform because I thought the band uniforms are cool.
Yeah.
The girls are attracted to the band uniforms. I got to figure out a way how to get a band uniform. So during the school year, I taught myself trumpet fingerings so that I could go to summer band camp and sort of already be prepared. And so I went to summer band camp, and the band director at one point said, "You know, if you switch to tuba, I'll let you keep one at your house."
Ooh.
Bam, done.
Were you tall back then?
I guess so. But the fact that I could have an instrument in my home, it much to the chagrin of all of my neighbors, probably. You know, there I was with my tuba. So I played cello in the orchestra, tuba in the band, and also what had happened in that 7th grade year was my string orchestra teacher asked who wanted to try to conduct, and I raised my hand, of course, and I got up, and I remember it was in 3/4 time, and 3/4 is odd, so there's an extra motion there that you don't know what to do with, so I couldn't get it right, and I said, "That's all right, I don't want to do it." He goes, "No," and he grabbed my hand and he showed me, and then he let go. So that was my first conducting experience. I mean, outside of when I was really small, and I would take my Army soldiers, plastic Army soldiers, and set them up like an orchestra and conduct them in my band.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
That's great.
Yeah. I used to tell people that my first conducting job was as a military band.
Cool.
But you know, I ultimately chose my undergraduate school based on the ability to have opportunity to conduct. That was Shenandoah Conservatory. I had played every summer. I got to go to band camp in Williamsburg playing tuba, and orchestra camp later in the summer playing cello. Well, I wanted to go to orchestra camp playing tuba so I could be the only person playing the instrument. So sure enough, summer of my junior year, I got to go playing tuba, and I met the tuba teacher at Shenandoah Conservatory, Fred Marzan, and he said, "You know, if you come to Shenandoah as a tuba major instead of cello, I'll let you be the student conductor of my brass choir." Done.
Yeah.
And so it was a kind of a neat little ride there.
Yeah.
And it was a school small enough that all the ensembles had student conductors. So every year I was a student conductor of some ensemble, and actually got to do a conducting recital there, which no one had ever done before. So it was a really neat opportunity.
Excellent. Growing up and kind of through your undergraduate period, were there any specific pieces that really clicked for you, or specific composers who made you realize you were doing what you were meant to do?
Yeah. Oh. One in particular was the hymn that's in Jupiter, that's embedded in Gustav Holst's Jupiter. That beautiful hymn that's just sort of stuck there. That always transported me to another place. The same thing with that same kind of music in Gershwin Rhapsody in Blue, for example. It always sent me someplace really special. And then the slow section of the last movement of Mahler's First Symphony. Beethoven said that music is the one incorporeal or intangible entrance into the higher world of knowledge, which understands mankind, but which mankind cannot understand. He's basically saying it knows us, though we know it not. To extend that out, I always say that we spend our lives as artists working on the substance of music, so that we can try to get to the essence of music, but we'll never be able to put the essence of music really into words. It's not enough to say forte means strong, forte means confident. It still won't get you to one of those moments. And so those were moments, and they remain moments for me. And in many instances, they are worshipful moments for me. It is my favorite time to worship, is when I'm conducting.
Definitely.
So it's... there have always been places like that. And when I come back to them now as a grown-up, they have an extra meaning, because they are a part of my aesthetic history as much as they are just a piece that I'm working on.
Do you ever associate those or other pieces with sort of milestone life events?
There are moments like that. I think, for example, the first time I heard the opera Dido and Aeneas, I sat in the library at New England Conservatory of Music, and you know what library I'm talking about, and I wept like a baby.
Oh, wow.
I had my headphones on, and I'm just crying.
Oh, my gosh.
So I know exactly where I was at that moment, and there are other places like that. In fact, there was a moment during the planets. The Venus movement, by the way, is another one of those exquisite moments for me. But during that hymn in that Jupiter, I didn't do it on purpose, but I was guest conducting somewhere, and my wife and my father-in-law were sitting together in the audience. And during that moment, when it got to its grandest place, I just let go of the orchestra. I didn't wave my arms. I just stayed in that position. And I think what I was saying is, look at how much bigger than we are this is. Yeah. And there was no movement that seemed to be necessary, and they got it.
Wow.
And my father-in-law said, look at what's he doing? And my wife said, oh, he's gone.
That's great.
She told me that later, that he's gone.
Neat.
Yeah.
Very cool.
And there is Enigma Elgar, the Nimrod variations. I remember being at a conducting camp, which sounds like the biggest nerd festival you can ever imagine. And I wasn't conducting at the time, but it was being played in the room, and I thought to myself, I was already married by then, and I thought to myself, that describes how much I love my wife right there. And I told her that later. So whenever I'm in that music, I think about that moment that I just made that sort of discovery, at summer music camp.
Yeah.
For grown-ups.
What was her response to that?
Oh, it got me some major points.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did she ever request it on the CD player or something like that? No. Or are you surprising?
No, she doesn't. But often I will share music with her if I'm someplace else that speaks of our relationship. If it touches me in a certain way, I'll send her a link to it, and
Neat.
just be romantic.
Wonderful. So after you did grad school, what was the path from there? Were you an assistant? Did you do festivals?
It's interesting. I didn't have, there's no rhyme or reason. There's no prescribed route in this country. You're not a repetiteur at one point, and then all of a sudden you get your chance. My first job out of graduate school was at a small college in Chicago, North Park College. It's now North Park University, small Christian college, which is, believe it or not, where I met my wife. And it was a liberal arts college with, with a, I think there were, first of all, there was only 8 people on the music faculty, so it meant that I did a lot of stuff. Taught orchestration. I taught sophomore theory one year. I taught all 3 levels of conducting, brass methods, string methods, because I played both. One year I taught percussion methods because I was the youngest person on the faculty, and therefore the person most likely to have remembered it from college. It was pretty funny. But when I called my teacher back at New England and said, "Oh my gosh, you're not going to believe what they had me doing for $15,000 a year," he said, "What are you talking about? That's a great job for you. You're not going to always be in front of the New York Philharmonic. You need to learn how to teach people to play better." And he was right. So it wasn't a crummy job. It was just not. It wasn't the New England Conservatory where I had just graduated from. Sure. And that was a whole different level of student musician. But it was good for me to be there, and I've always, not always believed, but certainly much of my life, I believed that you bloom where you're planted. And you try to grow wherever you are and contribute whatever you can while you're there, but to not let a day go by where you don't learn something. And I had always said that, excuse me, that more than anything I wanted to be prepared for the next thing. So that job led to another university job at University of Tennessee in Chattanooga, and I was only there for 2 years because I had taken the Richmond Symphony audition, the assistant conductor audition. And I made the finals, and then didn't hear anything. And it just so happened that Marion Alsop is a very good friend of mine, and she had also taken the audition. And so after a while, I called Marion and said, "Marion, I haven't heard a thing from Richmond. Have you?" She goes, "Oh, yeah, they hired me." I went, "Oh, no. Congratulations." We still crack up about that.
Yeah, that's great.
And then her career took off, and she left. She was leaving, preparing to leave. And so they called me and said, "We don't want to do another audition. Quite frankly, you were our second choice anyway. If you want the job is yours."
Wow.
So sure enough, I got that job, and I was there for, I don't know how long, 5, 6, 7 years maybe. And then I got a job with the Florida Orchestra as the resident conductor there. And that was great. And the best thing about that job was that, believe it or not, was that the music director was hardly ever there. So I got to learn how to do a lot of music director stuff, meet people, engage people, go on ask for funding. I became really an integral part of the community, getting on boards and involved in the life of the community outside of the concert hall. And that was really the formative years for me of learning how to be a conductor, is really learning how to be an artist in a community and how important it was. When I left Florida to go to Detroit, I guess that's where we went next, I was just walking down the street, and a lady stops at a red light, gets out of her car, and comes and hugs me and goes, "Oh, we're going to miss you so much." I don't know who that lady was.
Wow.
Yeah, it was really a neat thing. And it wasn't because I'm the greatest conductor they've ever seen, but it was because they had someone who really cared about their lives and their children's lives, and wanted to be partners with them in the raising of their children, and wanted to be partners with them in enhancing the quality of life in their community. That's what they saw. That's what they loved more than anything else, I think.
So how do you try to teach that kind of set of values to younger conducting colleagues or students, or even, relatives who are young and growing up, or your kids as well? Because I think a lot of those things that conductors deal with are life skills that maybe not everyone realizes. So you can go be a leader in your community, whether you're a conductor or you're a business person or whatever else. But yeah, I'd love to just hear your thoughts about that.
Well, people don't follow great leaders because they're necessarily great people. Great leaders present visions of things that are larger than us that we want to be a part of. And I think first and foremost, you have to live your life in a way that's reverent. So that no one ever thinks that you think you are more important than the music. And I think part of the success that I've had as a conductor is that when I'm in front of an orchestra, they all understand that together we are fortunate, first of all, to be in this room, and that we could be flipping hamburgers, but we're not. We are doing something that's really beyond all of us. And I say to them, you know, you have to realize that this music was here long before us, and it'll be here long after we're gone. We will never measure up to this music, but it's in the trying to measure up that we become artists. And the moment that we understand those parameters and we try to measure up, not only do we become artists, but hopefully we will become servants, so that we are really the conduits, so that this music can get communicated. Because these composers don't write music to demonstrate their skill at music theory. Mm-hmm. They write it to help us understand that we were made to be better than what we may have thought we were. So all of that attitude comes out in the kinds of words you choose and the way that you treat people. You know, I make it a habit to learn the names of the members of the orchestra before my first rehearsal. Mm-hmm. So I don't call them by their label or by their function. I call them by their name. Mm-hmm. And when you do that, it says, I value you as a human being. I have had on more than one occasion, someone in the orchestra, I'm not going to say the orchestra, but someone recently came to me and knocked on my dressing room door and said, you know, we always love it, making music when you're here. She says, but this week, everyone seems to be remarkable, because I was there for 2 weeks, mm-hmm. a long period. And she said, everyone seems to be talking about how kind you are to us. And I tried to blow it off, you know, hi, I'm just a nice guy. She said, no, you don't understand. It makes us treat each other differently. Mm. So that's the job of leadership, is to help usher people in to become better human beings. We want our audience to walk away better human beings, and we want our players to walk away better human beings. And if we put ourselves in front of that, it'll never happen. Mm-hmm. And so I think first and foremost, it's so really walk the talk, as it were. Live the life of a person who honors other people. It doesn't mean I'm not their boss. Mm-hmm. No one in my orchestra is mistaken about that, but they also know that I love them dearly as human beings, and I love their families, and I pray for them on a regular basis. That kind of stuff. I mean, you don't have to pray for them, but you know what I mean. It's that level of care for them. I think has to be demonstrated first, so that my assistants and our staff, they sort of get their cue from me as to how we're all going to treat each other, because their boss treats them in such a way that they feel compelled to treat other people that way. So I'm happy to say, like in Omaha, for example, it's a great team of people, and we want nothing but the best for each other. Mm-hmm. I had a young man send me a letter once. He had seen me conduct, and he wanted some advice on how to have a career. And he said in his email to me that his dream was to become the next renowned black conductor, on the globe. And I was so ticked off, and I just sat on the email for a few days, and I didn't answer. And then finally one day I just sat down and started typing. Oh boy. And I said, okay, if I can give you any advice, here's my first piece of advice. Don't ever say that again. Yeah. You can dream it, you can desire it, but don't ever say it out loud again, because you're going to give people the impression that this is all about you. Mm-hmm. I said, those people who are in your audience are real people with real challenges and real dreams and real hopes and real obstacles. And the whole reason that they come to you is so that you can equip them to leave the room better than the way they came in. And guess what? The players in your orchestra are the exact same people. And your job is to equip them to be better human beings when they leave you than when they came to you. Mm-hmm. And to his credit, he wrote back and said, no one has ever spoken to me like that before. No one has ever mentioned the word servant and leadership in the same sentence ever before. Wow. So I think it's. I said to one of my best friends, who's a lawyer. Actually, he's now sort of a lobbyist, but we are sort of accountability buddies. You know, we're both successful, both love our families and our children, and but we're both proud of each other, but we're not impressed with each other. You know, so you have to have you have to have friends like that. I said to him the other day, and he just turned 65, and I just turned 60, and your head goes through all kinds of junk, you know, the process. And I feel great. I mean, I exercise, I play golf, but there's still stuff that messes with your head. So I said, Jeff, I don't want to be the smart guy in the room. I don't want to be the guy handing out advice. I want to be dumb again, you know. But anyway.
Well, I'm sure that gentleman appreciated you giving him the lesson. Because
I think he did. I hope he did.
Because I'm sure he realizes that you're someone who is not going to share insights lightly, and that can have a significant positive impact on his own trajectory.
Right.
So that kind of opens a question about mentorship. What do you get involved in mentoring your assistants or other musicians in the orchestras, or do you kind of just do it more informally?
It's almost well, it's both, because we have a fellow at our in Omaha who's now actually, we have recently promoted him to being on staff as a conductor. Excuse me. And part of my agreement with him and them was that he would have to study with me during the course of the time that he's there. And now it's just he meets with me and he brings questions. Often they are conductorial questions, but sometimes, in fact, I just got a text from him a couple of days ago because he had an audition somewhere and he took the time to learn the major players' names in the orchestra, and he talked about how well they responded to that, you know. So it's all kinds of advice, and players come sometimes for they want a lesson, or they want to talk about how to exist in this business, or you know, how to learn a pattern. I have people, you know, to this day I have colleagues that I'll call and say, you know, I'm thinking about starting this movement in 4. You know, Leonard Slatkin is one that I always call and, you know, or email and say, I'm thinking about doing this. Is that crazy? You know, and he'll say, no, that's the way I do it too. You know, something like that. So I think, not to get hyper biblical on you, but I think every person needs a Paul, a Timothy, and a Barnabas in their life. You know, you need someone to teach, someone to learn from, and then someone who thinks you're not all that hot. Yeah. You know. So when the opportunity presents itself, I try never to shy away from it.
Great. Are there any sort of areas in the standard repertoire or contemporary repertoire that you haven't delved into as much as you'd like to, and what are they, and when do you plan to get to them?
That's the cool part, I think, is that there's always stuff you haven't done yet. And I've always been a big American music proponent, and so I've spent a lot of time doing American music. I would say I haven't spent enough time with French repertoire, and sometimes it's because if I look at my season and realize that the orchestra doesn't have enough of something on it, I will often invite someone for whom that's their expertise, because you want someone who's going to bring something to it that you won't bring to it just by having learned it. So sometimes that keeps me from getting the repertoire. But no, there's nothing in particular that I think I want to get to, except that I want to get to sort of making music outside the box more often. I want hip hop brought to the stage. You know, I live in the land of Saddle Creek records, so so this the whole indie rock thing is still going strong, and I didn't even know it until my nephew had to tell me. You know, I just love, and that's part of the fun that I have at the Hollywood Bowl, is that we can do. I mean, we literally did Sacrificial Dance from the Rite of Spring to open the show, and then John Legend and Stevie Wonder were the next things on stage. You know, I mean, I love that, and to have the opportunity to do more of that kinds of stuff, and that's kind of the fun part of my career. That means the fun for me. That's the fun thing about my career is that no 2 weeks are ever the same. I could be doing Shostakovich one night, and then Pink Martini the next night, and Ben Folds the next night, and Mozart the next night, and a children's concert the next night, and so no, I don't know. Maybe it's something that keeps me excited about it. Sure. That nothing's ever the same.
Yeah. On those programs where you juxtapose different genres, what kind of feedback do you get from the folks who might have just come for Stevie and then heard Rite of Spring for the first time?
Well, look, at the Hollywood Bowl, the audience understands that the night is going to be like that, sure. And they expect it to be like that, and they are always open to all kinds of things. But I think, Duke Ellington said there's only two kinds of music: good music and bad music. I think if because I talk to all of our audiences, that I'm sort of the thread for them that connects one piece to the next, and I can be professorial at one moment, or I can be a comedian, or a storyteller. Whatever it feels like, whatever seems to be necessary at the time, and it sort of helps people receive whatever it is that we're doing, and so it sort of mitigates some of their angst, I think. But so for the most part, I think people are excited, and we sort of haven't had any issues where people are, storming the Bastille. I was to tell you, though, it was the coolest thing that happened was the first thing out of Stevie Wonder's mouth was, "Oh man, that Stravinsky killed."
Nice.
So I have a friend who's James Carter, who you may know is a jazz saxophone player, one of the most compelling musicians I've ever been on stage with. We in Detroit were part of a commission of concerto for saxophones of Roberto Sierra. And one moment he's playing tenor sax, the next he's playing soprano. The orchestra's a classical orchestra that he persuades to become a jazz orchestra, then they persuade him to become a classical saxophonist. I mean, it's really, that's my perception. But it's a really cool piece. But when we did it in Omaha, we did it with Tchaik 4 for obvious reasons, because no one had heard of Roberto Sierra's concerto for saxophones, right? So we did a talk back afterwards, and on stage, and so there's all these jazzers who came to see James Carter because they were like, James Carter, Omaha Symphony, what's that about, So now they see James Carter, and they come up on stage for the talk back afterwards, and so one of them said, "So James," and he was, a little grin on his face. "What was it like being on a concert that also had Tchaikovsky's Fourth Symphony on it?" And James said, "Man, I was as stoked about hearing the Tchaikovsky as I was about playing my piece." Because so many people go to the parade and all they do is wait for the Miss America float. I want to see the whole parade. Yeah, I love that statement. It said music is music. Come on, man.
So how do we invite people to be open to changing their preconceptions about genres or classical concert etiquette, or entering a new space, picking up a new recording, checking out a new radio station?
I think it starts with us. I alluded to this earlier today in another conversation that I think as American artists, as American classical artists, because we operate in primarily a Western European tradition, that we're afraid that if we do anything that doesn't look like something Dvorak or Tchaikovsky or Brahms would approve of, people aren't going to take us seriously. When in reality, I did a program at the Hollywood Bowl where we invited over the Moulin Rouge dancers. Wow! And so I did a classical music first half of composers who probably hung out at the Moulin Rouge. Nice. Because they probably did. Yeah. They weren't stuck in some cave somewhere with just writing. My point is that we don't have to apologize for being an American orchestra. We don't have to apologize for being American, and we don't have to apologize for being an orchestra. And an orchestra, by its very nature, is one of the most diverse ensembles, or versatile ensembles rather, in existence, because we can become a chamber orchestra, we can become a quintet, we can become an octet, we can become anything out of that large contraption called the orchestra. And so we should run towards our versatility, not away from our versatility, because we can be different things for different people. If we take ourselves more seriously than we take our art, and by our art I mean all of this stuff, you know, if you listen to Naima, John Coltrane, and you think that's not as poignant as any symphony of Beethoven, you are out of your mind. Or if you listen to Miles Davis, you think basically it was a trumpet player who missed notes, you're nuts. And so we as artists have to be the voice for that versatility. But we think if we play in a, and this generation of musicians doesn't think that way by any stretch, which is really cool, because they're playing in rock and roll bars, or some of them are even playing rock and roll. You know, a colleague, Joshua Roman, is a great example of, he just played Dvorak with me in Omaha because my soloist got hurt his hand. It was a pianist, and Joshua had just been there doing Aaron J. Kerner's concerto, which involves a pick, and I mean there's jazz and all kinds of stuff on another series. And so, and he got snowed in. I mean, he basically couldn't get back to New York, so we had him stay and do the Dvorak. But he's a great example of someone who has removed the labels from music. And this is not to say that there should not be nights where you hear a Beethoven, a Mozart, and a Haydn, or Brahms and a Schubert or a Mahler on a program. This is not to suggest that at all. It's just to say that in the process, let me see how much I can move you along to try something else, because it's very possible that you're going to like this too. And part of it too is also a matter of trust. I had a Russian pianist say to me once, "How come American orchestras have so much trouble with the word groove?" And I said, "How come a Russian pianist is asking me that question?" You know, how weird is that, that you're asking me why my orchestra has trouble with understanding? Beethoven knew what a groove was. If you listen to the last movement of Beethoven 7, you tell me that's not a groove, for crying out loud. He wouldn't have used that word, but he understood the sensation. And if we can make those kinds of connections with people, you know, I think we are better off. I grew up with guys. I was the only classical music guy in my group of friends. You know, I mean, the Wooten brothers and Billy Drummond, those guys, we'd get together on weekends, and I'm playing Tchaikovsky for them because we had records in those days, and that's how we geeked out on weekends. We just sat around and listened to music. They're playing Green Dolphin Street for me, and you know, Four and More, and all this stuff. We're just sharing. That's all, you know. And just recently, I said to one of them, had it not been for those experiences, maybe I wouldn't be the kind of conductor that I am. That can one moment can do Mahler, and then the next moment can do, you know, Stevie Wonder. But
neat.
Yeah.
So with the community engagement you've discussed, there are lots of ways for the audience and the musicians to kind of stay engaged with the institution of the orchestra outside of the concert experience. What do you think are the ways of engaging with each other that lend the experience to growth? So like, is that social media? Is that attending the talkbacks? Is that just seeing people out in your community at the grocery store? And by growth, you mean growth in numbers, or growth in humanity, or growth all of the above? The humanity portion especially, or developing a more nuanced appreciation for the institution and that culture that you're being part of.
What we have said is that if you mention the word music in Omaha, we want your first thought to be the Omaha Symphony. What I've said often, as an example, to your point, is if I get in a taxi cab, often if I get in a car and I'm not being picked up by the orchestra's driver, and they say, "What are you doing in town?" I'll say, "I'm here to conduct the blank, blank, blank," but I'll say the letters of the orchestra, not the word orchestra, because I want to know, do they know what I mean when I say NSO or, you know, LPO or whatever it is? And if they go, "What's that?" I go, "Rut-row," you know? And I said, however, if I get in the car and say, do you go to concerts? And the driver says, no. He says, I don't really care for it. But he says, but my goodness, did they turn my 11-year-old around? Mm. Then the orchestra, in my mind, the orchestra's doing its job. It's proved its quote-unquote relevancy. I had a cab driver in Omaha. I got in the cab, and he had classical music on, and I was going to the airport. And so I just said, so do you always play classical music? He goes, oh yeah, it just relaxes me. I just that. He says, sometimes it'll be jazz, but most often it's classical music. I said, huh. And I said, do you ever go to concerts? And at this point, I see him looking in the rearview mirror. His eyes, he kept, on the road in the rearview mirror, and then finally he goes, "Hey, you're the maestro."
Nice.
And does he go to? No, he doesn't go to concerts. But somehow, we have entered his life in a way that he feels that this is something he wants to be a part of. So it's important to be seen in the grocery store or Home Depot, which is my two lows, my favorite places to hang out. And you do, I know they're all anecdotal, but they still count because they're still people's stories, and they are sharing those stories with you. I'm standing in the checkout line at Walmart. This guy, the cashier's tatted up like crazy. His hair's weird. Well, it's not weird, but it wasn't my hair, that's for sure. So I had already decided who this person was, right? Wrong. Bad thing to do. Sure enough, I get up to the counter. The dude said, man, that Rite of Spring performance was really great. What?
That's amazing. So what'd you say back?
Busted. And here's the thing. To your earlier point about growth and even growth in numbers and making people feel comfortable in the concert hall, if we don't have diversity, if you don't let people be diverse, you got to call it something else. Yeah. So if I'm going to judge the guy who's tatted up, who comes in the concert hall, not in a suit, then shame on me. Yeah. He deserves to hear this music too, So that was a great thing. Or going through the security line at the airport, the guy looked at my driver's license and said, "Have a good flight, maestro."
In Omaha? Or
in Omaha.
Wow, cool.
Yeah. So people are always doing that kind of thing, which tells me, and I'm involved in so many different kinds of things that have nothing to do with music. With the boards that I have served on, or the groups that I have volunteered for, or the places that I've given speeches. I gave the commencement speech at an elementary school in Omaha. Oh, wow. It was the most fun, when you do those kinds of things, either myself or our staff of conductors or musicians playing in various places, the orchestra ends up having an imprint all across the community in the rarest and sometimes the most secluded of corners. And it has nothing to do with those people ultimately coming to the Holland Performing Arts Center for a concert. It has everything to do with us giving away this gift of sound. A friend of mine who's a visual artist said he says, how did he put it? He says, outreach is about us coming to you is like outreach, or you coming to us is about marketing. But us coming together, that's about community. Yeah. And so that's you can be a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and everyone is served, and everyone is made better.
So, I think to wrap this up, I'd like to hear from you how that ethos about community can be instilled in more conductors and more musicians. I know we've touched upon this a little bit, but it's not something that you're taught in music school. Right. It's not something that you're taught by all your private teachers, whether it's a conducting teacher or an instrument. Who filled that role for you?
In a lot of instances, by not growing up in a house with a father, I had to become a sponge. Why those things became important to me, I can't answer that. That was just, I feel that, again, without getting hyper religious, I do feel that this is God's call in my life. This is the thing that I'm supposed to be doing. And And so there, for me, there's a certain responsibility right off the bat. And that part of that responsibility means that there has to be a certain humility, because I didn't create this talent in me. I didn't create the ability to be a good public speaker. I didn't, a friend of mine said that well, all I did was I was obedient when I was given a gift. That I didn't, throw it away, or that's the only thing I can take the credit for, was that I was obedient. Again, one of those friends who don't think you're all that special. But I think by being a sponge, it meant that my ears were always open. And I used to journal at some point, and I knew that I wanted. It helps when you have role models, and sometimes those role models don't know they're your role models, but they were almost always older men who were good fathers and good husbands, and I said, the best thing I can do for my children is to love their mother. Once one guy said to me, he says, I'll always know what kind of man you are by the smile on your wife's face. He didn't say I'll know what kind of husband you are. He said I'll know what kind of man you are. We are good at being boys. We can be boys till we're 50, but it takes somebody special to come along to teach us how to be men. And I think in the process of learning how to become a man, or if I were a woman, basically what I'm saying is a grown-up, a real grown-up. Sure. You have to always be aware of what you don't know, and so there have just been people. Sometimes there have been people in my church. Sometimes there have been people in business. Sometimes there have been people in the music business. But there's always been someone who may have said something or did something and made me go, "Ooh, I gotta write that down and keep that." And then I'm a ponderer, that was for me. That was what did it. Was just being willing to listen and to learn something, and from anybody. Anybody can teach you anything. I have a mantra of the last few years that says, every day I want to love something, learn something, and leave something behind. Wynton Marsalis said that he was saying it to a group of kids. He said that, your biggest competitor is not the other person in the room. Your biggest competitor is your ignorance. So if you get up every day and decide to do battle with your biggest competitor, then every day you win something, And I think maybe that was, I had a friend whose dad was a salesman, a very successful salesman. So he turned me on to, those like all of those sort of like Robert Schuller, move ahead with possibility thinking, the guy who invented the round to it, who's Zig Ziglar. These are guys that business guys are reading. I'm reading those as a young, undergrad, thinking there has to be a route, to whatever success is. And growing up in a housing project, poor, is a great motivator. And I will tell this one story of myself, if you don't mind.
Please, yeah.
Because I still, to this day, tell it to my teacher at New England Conservatory, who, by the way, when he came to my first Boston Symphony concert, pulled me aside and gave me some instructions.
Oh, yeah? Oh, who was this?
Richard Pittman.
Oh, okay.
Crack.
Oh,
he said, you mind if I tell you, make a couple
That's
comments?
really
I went, sure. But, so here I was, I wanted to be a conductor since I was 8 years old. And I had all these opportunities through, high school. I was a student conductor of the band, and my band director let me conduct every day.
Wow.
And if he was going to be absent, he would just have them hire someone to take role, and I would be completely in charge. I mean, all these unbelievable opportunities in college every year, undergraduate school. So I took 2 years off, and I don't have perfect pitch, I took an audition at NEC, New England Conservatory. There were 3 spots open. There were 28 people auditioning for those 3 spots. And so the first part of the day you had to conduct the orchestra. Well, I'm so charming. I mean, I'm comfortable on the podium, and I had been for a long time. The orchestra stood up and applauded at my audition. I was feeling like really good. And then in the afternoon, 7 of us at a time, we had to take the musical skills test. And his musical skills test was like, okay, here's a G. All right, now I'm going to play through this twice. So I'm thinking, he's already done with the first time. I'm thinking, okay, G, so now we're in the key E flat. Well, the piece is gone by the time I figure out what key we're in, And so, and then the single line dictation that was like boom, 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 stuff, this kind of stuff, and then the piano requirement. My mother couldn't afford piano lessons. I had like class piano as an undergraduate. That was it. So then we had personal interviews with him, and the 7 of us went to lunch together, and we were all like shaking our heads, going, "This ain't happening," And so I go to lunch, and I have my personal meeting with him, and he goes, "You remind me of Pierre Monteur," and I went, "Whoa, oh my gosh, he's comparing me to somebody famous," He says, "I believe you could get an orchestra to do anything just because of your nature on the podium. You're very charming." He says. And then he took out my test, and he held it like this. He says, "But this is ridiculous."
Oh, no.
And I went, And he said, "Look, you don't want to be a charlatan. You have to have intellectual integrity and artistic integrity." And it turned out he was a person who also demonstrated moral integrity, which was great, speaking of role models. He says, "I don't know if I'm going to take you." He says, "But I'll tell you what." He says, "If I were to take you and you're conducting alone, I would save one of these 3 spots for you right now, even without hearing the last group of 7. I was in the penultimate group of 7. He says, "But I'll tell you what, if I do take you, you're going to have to work your butt off. And if you don't, and hear the words, I will not hesitate to kick you out of school."
Ooh.
And those are the words that changed my life. Because to have grown up the way I grew up, to have had the dream to the level that I've had it, and to be on the doorstep of the very place that could turn that dream into a reality, and to have someone say, that changed everything. By the following year, I was his graduate assistant. And I'm a great source of pride for him, because when my wife first met him, she goes, "You've made my husband a workaholic." He goes, and he said, "Yep." So, but he really did. He said, "This is not how you become a conductor." And so he taught me how to work, and I had to be able to play any of the Bach chorales in open score in order to graduate. I was like every morning, at the piano. But it was the greatest gift anyone could ever give anyone, and that is to say, wishing without working only leads to disappointment.
Definitely. Well, I think that's a great moment to end. And I really appreciate your taking the time to share your story with us. And we hope that this is the beginning of a very long and wonderful relationship with the library. And we appreciate your being part of the Shift Festival. And can't wait to go hear you in concert coming up.
Me too. It was a great fun.
Thank you, Maestro. Appreciate it.
Take care.
Thank you, everyone, and feel free to visit us on loc.gov to learn more about the library's interviews with leading American musicians. Have a great one.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.